The morning my mother was buried, it rained so hard the flowers on her casket were destroyed before we even lowered her into the ground. I remember standing at the edge of the grave in my black dress, watching the white roses dissolve into brown mush against the mahogany lid, and thinking, that's exactly what this family does. It takes beautiful things and ruins them. My name is Vivian. I'm the middle child of 3, and for 41 years I have lived in the space between my siblings like a piece of furniture nobody quite knew where to put. Not as bold as my older brother Derek, not as delicate as my younger sister Renata. Just Vivian. Reliable, quiet, always there, and somehow always invisible. Mom had been sick for 2 years. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in the winter, relentless by the following spring. I was the one who drove her to chemotherapy every Tuesday. I was the one who learned to change her port dressing, who researched clinical trials at midnight while the rest of the house slept, who sat beside her hospital bed reading her old Agatha Christie novels because she said the sound of my voice was the only thing that made the pain feel smaller. Derek visited 6 times in 2 years. I counted. Renata visited 11 times, but 8 of those were weekend trips where she spent most of the time redecorating Mom's living room and calling it, making the space more healing. I never said anything. That's the thing about being the invisible middle child. You learn early that saying something costs more than staying silent. The will reading was scheduled for the Thursday after the funeral, at the offices of Gerald Harmon, my mother's attorney of 23 years. The office smelled like old leather and cold coffee, and Gerald himself was a small, careful man who had the energy of someone who had witnessed too many family implosions to be surprised by another one. Derek arrived in an Italian suit. Renata arrived with her husband, Paul, who had not been invited but had come anyway in the way that Paul always did things. Assuming his presence was welcome, never once checking. I arrived alone. We sat in a row of chairs across from Gerald's desk, and I noticed immediately that Derek and Renata had already been talking before I arrived. There was a particular ease between them, a shared frequency I recognized, but had never been included in. They glanced at each other when I walked in. Just a glance. But I felt it like a door closing. Gerald opened the file. He read in the measured, emotionless voice of a man delivering cargo. The house on Marigold Lane, 3 bedrooms, paid off, valued at $480,000, was to be divided equally between Derek and Renata. The investment portfolio, approximately $212,000, was to be divided equally between Derek and Renata. The jewelry collection, including the antique pearl set that had belonged to our grandmother, was to go to Renata. The 1967 Ford Mustang that Dad had restored before he died, and that Mom had kept in the garage under a canvas tarp for 17 years, was to go to Derek. I sat very still. Gerald continued reading. A donation to the church. A bequest to the neighbor who had brought Mom's soup every Friday. A small gift to the hospice organization that had provided her final care nurse. And then he reached the end of the document. He closed the folder. The room was very quiet. Derek shifted in his chair. Renata reached over and touched his arm. A small, rehearsed gesture, I would later think. Paul cleared his throat. I had not been mentioned. Not once. Not in a single line of my mother's final legal declaration of love. That's the complete document, Gerald said, looking directly at me in a way that told me he was uncomfortable, that he knew what I was sitting with, and that he could do absolutely nothing about it. I heard Renata exhale, not in grief but in relief. The kind of exhale that follows the moment you realize you got what you wanted. I did not cry. I had no tears available for this particular wound. What I felt was something older and colder. The sensation of having a suspicion you'd carried for decades confirmed in the most official way possible. I stood. I picked up my coat. I said, "Thank you, Gerald, because I am above all things polite." I walked to the door. And then Gerald said the thing that would unravel the next 6 weeks of my life. "Ms. Vivian, there is one more item." I turned. He was holding an envelope. Not a legal document. Not a folder. A plain white envelope, sealed with wax the color of dried blood, with my name written on the front in my mother's handwriting. The handwriting she had used in the last months, slower, more deliberate, the letters leaning into each other for support. "Your mother left specific instructions," Gerald said carefully. "This is not part of the estate documents. It was left separately with instructions that it be given to you, and only to you, after the will was read in full." Derek's jaw tightened. Renata's hand went still on Derek's arm. I walked back across the room and took the envelope from Gerald's hand. It was heavier than it should have been, Not physically, but in the way that certain objects carry the weight of what they contain. I put it in my coat pocket without opening it. "Aren't you going to read it?" Renata asked. Her voice was perfectly calibrated. Curious, casual. The voice of someone who was not at all worried about the contents of a letter their mother had sealed in wax and kept secret until after her death. "No," I said. "Not here." I walked out into the rain. I sat in my car for 4 minutes before I allowed myself to feel anything. Then I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and let out a sound I had never made before. Something between a sob and a scream and a laugh, all at once. The sound of a person whose entire history of loving someone has just been publicly audited and found worthless. But the envelope was in my pocket, and my mother had used the wax seal she reserved for things that mattered. I drove home without opening it. Not because I wasn't desperate to, but because some part of me understood, in the way you sometimes understand things in your body before your mind catches up, that whatever was inside that envelope was going to change everything. And I needed one more night of not knowing. I did not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table from 10 in the evening until just past 3 in the morning with the sealed envelope in front of me, and a cup of tea that went cold, and then a second cup that went the same way. My cat, a gray tabby named Ptolemy, sat on the other chair and watched me with the particular patience of an animal who understands that humans sometimes need to be witnessed without being helped. The wax seal was circular. In the center, my mother had pressed her thumb. I could see the whirl of her fingerprint fossilized in the red wax like something prehistoric. She had done this deliberately. She had thought about this. She had pressed her thumb into wax and thought of me. I broke the seal at 3:17 in the morning. Inside were 3 things. The first was a handwritten letter, 4 pages long, written on the cream stationery she had kept in her desk drawer for as long as I could remember. The paper with the small violet border that she used only for what she called real correspondence. The second was a smaller sealed envelope, this one with the name of a law firm printed in the upper left corner. Hargrove and Associates. Not Gerald's firm. The third was a photograph. I looked at the photograph first because I am the kind of person who reads the last page of a novel, and because I knew that whatever the letter said would require me to be steady, and the photograph might tell me what kind of steadiness I needed. It was a picture of me and my mother. I was perhaps 7 years old. We were in the backyard of the old house, before the divorce, before Derek's anger, before Renata learned to perform sweetness like a second language. My mother was crouched down to my level, and we were both looking at something in the grass, a caterpillar, I remembered suddenly, with a vividness that surprised me. A fat green caterpillar we had found near the rose bushes. My mother's hand was curled around my small hand, guiding my finger toward the creature. Her face was angled toward mine, not toward the camera, and the expression on it was one I had spent my whole life trying to reconstruct from memory. Pure, undivided attention. She was looking at me like I was the most interesting thing in the world. I set the photograph down, and I read the letter. I will not transcribe every word here, because some things belong to the space between a mother and a daughter and no one else. But I will tell you what she said. I will tell you the bones of it because the bones are what matter. She began with an apology. Not the small, cushioned kind, the real kind, the kind that costs something to write. She said she had spent the last year of her life in a particular form of agony that had nothing to do with the cancer. She said she had known, for most of my adult life, what Derek and Renata were. She used that word carefully, what they were. Not who. What. She said she had watched Derek manipulate her finances for 11 years. Small amounts at first, a loan here, a borrowed some there, and then in the last 5 years larger movements. A transfer she hadn't authorized. A signature on a document she had no memory of signing. She had gone to Gerald 2 years before her diagnosis, quietly, without telling anyone, and begun a parallel process. She said Renata had known about some of it, and had chosen comfort over honesty. Had chosen the inheritance over the truth. She said she had left the estate to them in the primary will because she needed them to believe, until after the reading, that they had won. She needed their guard down. She needed them to not go looking. And then she told me what to do with the second envelope. I read that part 3 times. The second envelope, she wrote, contained documents she had compiled with Hargrove and Associates. A firm Derek and Renata knew nothing about, located 2 towns over, retained specifically because it had no connection to the family name. Inside that envelope were records. Bank statements. A forensic accountant's summary. Copies of the unauthorized transfers. And a deed. A deed to a property I had never heard of. A small house on the coast of Maine, purchased in my mother's name 18 years ago and placed, quietly and without ceremony, into a trust. A trust with a single beneficiary. My name. The house, the letter said, was worth approximately $340,000. She had also funded the trust with a separate account, managed through Hargrove, invisible to Gerald's documents, invisible to Derek's maneuvering, containing $260,000. $600,000. Sitting in a trust. In my name. For 18 years. She wrote. I knew I would not be able to protect it in the primary will. Derek watches the primary will. He has been watching it for a decade. The only way to keep this safe for you was to make sure he never knew it existed. She wrote. I'm sorry it took me this long to find a way to tell you that you were never invisible to me. I saw everything. I just didn't know, for too long, how to fight for what was right without destroying what was left of this family. She wrote. By the time you read this, it will be too late to tell me whether you forgive me. So I'm going to ask you to do something harder than forgiving me. I'm going to ask you to fight. I sat with that for a long time. Then she wrote one more thing. One thing at the very bottom of the last page, in handwriting that was shakier than the rest, written later, I guessed maybe close to the end. She wrote, the envelope from Hargrove also contains something else. Something Derek doesn't know I found. Something that changes everything for him, too. Be careful how you use it, Vivian. Power used for revenge becomes its own poison. But power used for truth, that's something else entirely. I folded the letter. I put the photograph in my shirt pocket, against my chest. I looked at the sealed envelope from Hargrove and Associates for a very long time. And then I made a decision that I did not yet fully understand the weight of. I did not open the Hargrove envelope that night. Instead, I picked up my phone and searched for the address of Hargrove and Associates. I found their website, small, professional, a photograph of a silver-haired woman named Eleanor Hargrove listed as the founding partner. I sent an email at 4 a.m, introducing myself, stating that my mother had left me an envelope, and asking for the earliest available appointment. By the time I fell asleep on the couch at 5:30, there was a reply in my inbox. Eleanor Hargrove had been waiting for my email for 2 years. If you're still watching right now, you're exactly the kind of viewer I love. Subscribe so I can keep giving you stories that touch your heart. Hit that bell so you never miss what happens next. Eleanor Hargrove's office was nothing like Gerald's. Where Gerald's space communicated the comfortable authority of old money, Eleanor's office communicated precision. Clean lines. A single orchid on the windowsill. Bookshelves organized not by subject, but by some system I couldn't immediately identify. And the inability to immediately identify it told me this was a woman who operated on a logic not everyone was invited to follow. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair cut close to her head and glasses that she wore on a chain, but never actually on her face. She stood when I came in and shook my hand the way people shake hands when they mean it. Vivian, she said. I've been holding these documents for 22 months. I sat down. Your mother was one of the most methodical clients I've ever had, Eleanor said, taking her seat across from me. She came to me specifically because she needed someone who operated entirely outside of her family's awareness. We met 8 times over the course of 14 months. Always here. Always during the week, when your brother and sister would be at work. Always under a different reason on her calendar. She told your sister she was attending a church book club on Tuesday afternoons. Something between a laugh and a sob moved through me. That was so entirely my mother. The church book club alibi was so perfectly her, plausible, uncheckable beneath Derek's radar. Tell me what's in the envelope, I said. Eleanor opened the file on her desk. She walked me through it methodically, with the calm efficiency of someone who had prepared for this briefing the way a general prepares for a campaign. The coastal property in Maine, a 3-bedroom house on 2 acres overlooking Penobscot Bay, purchased in 2006, mortgaged and paid off by 2019, now fully owned by the Vivian Caldwell Family Trust, named without fanfare and without announcement 18 years ago. I had owned a house for 4 years without knowing it. The trust account balance was, as my mother's letter had suggested, $263,000. My mother had deposited small, consistent amounts over 18 years. Never large enough to trigger questions, always routed through a separate account that Derek had no access to or knowledge of, because it predated his involvement in her finances. Eleanor then opened the second section of the file, and here her voice shifted slightly, not less professional but more careful. The way a person's voice shifts when they know they are about to set something irreversible into motion. This section, she said, concerns your brother." She laid 3 documents on the desk between us. The first was a bank record showing a transfer of $47,000 from my mother's primary savings account to an LLC registered in Delaware. The transfer was dated 4 years ago. My mother had not authorized it. The signature on the authorization form was a copy of her signature. But according to a handwriting analyst Eleanor had retained, it was not my mother's hand. The second document was a property record. Derek had purchased a vacation property in Colorado 18 months ago. The down payment, $85,000, had come in routed installments from 3 sources. One of those sources was an account that had been funded by my mother's investment portfolio without her authorization. The third document made me go very still. It was a copy of a power of attorney document. Signed, notarized, filed with Gerald's office 3 years ago. The document gave Derek broad financial authority over my mother's affairs in the event of incapacitation or cognitive decline. "She never signed this," Eleanor said quietly. "She was tested by her physician at my request 9 months before she died. Full cognitive assessment, she passed with no impairments. She was mentally sharp to the end. And she told me on record that she had no memory of signing any power of attorney document and had never intended to grant Derek that authority." The room felt very small suddenly. Derek had manufactured a power of attorney, had used it, or the threat of it, to access my mother's accounts. And Gerald, whose office had filed the document, had either not looked closely enough or had not wanted to. "What does this mean legally?" I asked. "It means," Eleanor said, "that your brother committed elder financial abuse and fraud. It means the transfers were illegal. It means the power of attorney document is potentially forged. And it means that if you choose to pursue this, you have grounds for both civil and criminal action." The word criminal hung in the air between us like smoke. I thought about Derek in his Italian suit. I thought about Renata's careful exhale of relief in Gerald's office. I thought about 11 visits in 2 years and the way my mother had looked at me from her hospital bed during the long chemotherapy Tuesdays and said, with more peace than I understood at the time, "You're the only one who shows up, Vivian." That sentence had always felt like a simple observation. Now I understood it was also a document. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said. I had known there would be. My mother's letter had warned me. Eleanor slid a single sheet across the desk. It was a printed email chain, forwarded to my mother by someone she'd trusted, whose name was redacted in the copy Eleanor showed me, but whose account domain was unmistakably Renata's husband Paul's company email. The emails were between Derek and Paul. They had been planning it for at least 3 years. Not just the financial maneuvering, but the will itself. They had been in contact with Gerald, discussing the distribution of your mother's estate in emails that predated her death by 31 months. Paul had suggested specific language. Derek had approved it. Gerald had. And this was the part that made my stomach drop, responded. Gerald had known. Gerald, who had looked at me across the desk with those uncomfortable eyes, who had delivered the will in his careful cargo voice. Gerald had been part of it. Why didn't she go to the police herself? I asked. My voice was steadier than I expected. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She was dying, she said finally. And she was still their mother. She told me in our last meeting, 8 days before she passed, that she couldn't bear to be the one to destroy them. She said that was her greatest failure and her greatest love, existing in the same sentence. Eleanor paused. She asked me to give you everything and let you decide. She said you were the only one she trusted to decide correctly. I picked up the documents and held them in my hands. These thin pages that contain the architecture of a betrayal years in the making. I thought about power used for revenge becoming its own poison. I thought about power used for truth. I asked Eleanor one question. If I pursue this, all of it, what happens to Derek? Eleanor looked at me steadily. Criminal charges for financial elder abuse carry a sentence of up to 4 years in this state. The forged power of attorney adds fraud charges. Civil liability could require full restitution plus damages. The Colorado property would likely be seized. And Gerald, disbarment proceedings at minimum. Possible conspiracy charges. I nodded slowly. And Renata? Eleanor's expression didn't change. The emails suggest she didn't know the full extent. But she knew something. And she accepted the inheritance anyway. I stood. I put the documents back into the Hargrove envelope. I thanked Eleanor with the same politeness I had thanked Gerald. But this time the politeness meant something different. This time it was the politeness of a woman who knew exactly what she was about to do, and was choosing to enter that knowledge with dignity. I walked to the door. And then I stopped because something was suddenly urgently wrong. My phone was buzzing. A text from an unknown number. 6 words. We need to talk. Before you do anything. I stared at the screen. The contact wasn't saved. But I recognized the writing style immediately. The specific grammatical tick. The way the period sat at the end like a warning. It was Renata. She knew I had been to see Eleanor. How she knew, and what she wanted to say before I did anything, was something I could not yet answer. But the fact that she had reached out told me everything I needed to know about the size of what I was holding. I did not respond to Renata's text that day. Or the next day. I spent those 48 hours doing something I had not done in years. Thinking entirely and exclusively about myself. About what I wanted. Not what was fair, not what was just, not what my mother would have approved of, but what Vivian, middle child, invisible daughter, woman who had driven to chemotherapy every Tuesday for 2 years and been thanked in a sealed envelope while her siblings divided a house. What she actually wanted from this. It was a harder question than I expected. On the 3rd day, I called Renata back. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods, neutral ground, public space, the kind of arrangement you make when you're not sure whether you're meeting an ally or an adversary. I arrived first and ordered the same tea I always ordered and sat at a table near the window where I could see the door. Renata walked in looking like she hadn't slept. Her hair, which was always done, was pulled back in a way that told me she'd made a decision about how to present herself, not polished, not performative. She was trying to appear honest before she'd said a single word. I noted it. I did not trust it. She sat down across from me and looked at her hands. I need to tell you something, she said, before you do whatever you're planning to do. All right, I said. I didn't know about the power of attorney. She looked up. I want you to know that. I didn't know Derek had forged anything. I knew he had. I knew he had taken some money. I knew it wasn't right. But I told myself it was family, and that Mom had always given Derek what he needed, and that, she stopped. I told myself a story that let me not look too closely. I said nothing. Paul was involved, she said. More than I knew. The emails you presumably have copies of. Those were between Paul and Derek. I didn't know about those either. Not until Derek called me 2 days after the will reading and told me you'd been to see a lawyer he didn't recognize. I felt something cold move through me. Derek had been watching. He'd somehow tracked my movement to Eleanor's office, or Eleanor's name had appeared somewhere, a credit card charge, a calendar entry, something. He was already moving pieces. What does Derek want? I asked. He wants you to stay quiet. Renata said it without dressing it up. She at least had that much. He told me to reach out to you. To talk you down. To offer you, he used the word settle. He said he'd give you 1/3 of the estate value in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement. He wants to buy my silence. Yes. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, the way you look at someone when you're trying to read what layer of them is actually speaking. I saw guilt there. Real guilt, not performed guilt. I also saw something I had not expected, fear. Not fear of me. Fear of Paul. Fear of what her husband had built without her full knowledge, and what it might cost her when it came apart. Renata, I said carefully, are you safe? She blinked. The question surprised her. What do you mean? Paul. Are you safe with Paul? The pause that followed was not long. But it was long enough. He controls a lot of things, she said finally. He has for a long time. Something settled into place in my understanding of the last several years. Renata's choices, her performance of loyalty to Derek, her careful silence at the will reading. She had not been simply greedy. She had been navigating something I hadn't seen, from inside a marriage I didn't fully understand. This did not excuse her, but it changed the shape of her. I'm not going to sign an NDA, I said. I want you to tell Derek that. He won't take that well. I know. Vivian. She reached across the table and touched my hand. I'm not asking you to protect Derek. I'm asking you to, please let me find a way to be on the right side of this. I know I should have been there sooner. I know I should have asked more questions. I am not a good person in this story. Her voice broke just slightly on that last sentence. But I don't want to be Derek's person either. Not anymore. I looked at her for a long time. Then here's what you're going to do, I said. I told her. Renata's eyes went wider with each sentence. By the time I finished, her hand had gone still and cold over mine. That's, she started. Yes, I said. It is. Derek will come after you. He can try. Gerald is connected to people, Vivian. He's been practicing law in this county for 30 years. People will. Renata. I said her name quietly, but in a register that stopped her. Mom knew all of this. She knew Gerald was connected. She knew Derek had been building this for a decade, and she spent 2 years while she was dying, quietly building something else. Something they couldn't see coming. She left it to me. I met my sister's eyes. Do you understand what she did? She made sure that when the moment came, I would have everything I needed. She didn't leave me nothing. She left me everything that mattered. The visible will was theater. This. I touched the Hargrove envelope in my bag. This is the real one. Renata was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" I told her that too. I drove home that afternoon and sat in the driveway for a moment before going inside. I thought about the house in Maine, the one I owned without knowing it, the one my mother had tucked quietly into a trust and named for me while I was learning to change her port dressing. I had looked it up the night before. There were photographs on a property website. The trust's registered address had made it findable. White clapboard siding, a wide porch facing the water, a garden that had gone to seed but could be restored. Penobscot Bay visible from the upper windows on a clear day. My mother had given me a house at the edge of the ocean. I did not know yet if she had known how much I would need it, or if she had simply known me well enough to understand that this was who I was. Someone who needed a place to stand at the edge of something vast and be reminded that the world extended beyond the family's damage. I thought she had known. That evening, I called Eleanor and told her to file everything. The next morning, my phone erupted. Derek called 11 times before 9 in the morning. I did not answer. I made coffee. I fed Ptolemy. I stood at my kitchen window and watched a sparrow dismantle a maple seedling with calm, systematic focus, and I found this deeply relatable. On the 12th call, I picked up. He did not start with charm. I had thought he might. Derek had always led with charm, the broad smile and the easy voice that had worked on our mother for so long. But charm was for people who still held the advantage, and Derek had spent the last 18 hours discovering, piece by piece, that he did not. He started with threats. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said. His voice had the particular flatness of a man trying to contain something larger than a voice can hold. "This family, what's left of it, you're going to destroy it." "Hello, Derek," I said. "Don't do that. Don't be calm at me right now. Would you prefer I not be calm?" "I am trying to tell you." He stopped. Started again. "The money. I can give back a portion of it. I can structure a payment." "Eleanor's office filed the complaint yesterday evening," I said. The forensic accounting summary went to the State Financial Crimes Unit. The forged power of attorney went to the County District Attorney's office. Gerald's Bar Association was notified this morning. I picked up my coffee. The civil suit will be filed by end of week. The silence on the line had a texture to it, dense and vertiginous, the sound of a man watching a structure he built over a decade collapse in a sequence he cannot stop. "You're going to destroy this family," he said again, but quieter now. The threat had gone out of it. What remained was something more complicated, something that might, in a different kind of brother, have been grief. "Derek," I said, and I tried to keep my voice as level as I had promised myself it would be. "Mom knew what you did. She knew it for years. And she was dying, and she still couldn't find it in herself to be the one to call the police on her own son. So she left it to me. She left me everything I needed to make this right, and she left me the choice of whether to use it." I paused. "I am not doing this to destroy anyone. I'm doing it because she asked me to fight for truth. And because the woman who drove her to chemotherapy every Tuesday for 2 years, the woman she called the only one who shows up, that woman deserved better than to be erased from a will while you were in Colorado at a ski house you paid for with her retirement savings." Another silence. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Lower. Tired. "I didn't think you knew about Colorado. I know about a lot of things now." He hung up. I set down my phone and realized my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the particular tremor that follows the release of something you've been holding a very long time without knowing you were holding it. The legal proceedings moved quickly. Eleanor had prepared well, and the State Financial Crimes Unit moved with unusual speed. I would later learn that my mother's case was not the first time Derek's LLC had appeared in their peripheral vision. The forensic evidence was clean and documented. The forged power of attorney, when examined by the same expert witness Eleanor had retained, was definitively found to not be my mother's signature. Gerald cooperated. This surprised me. Eleanor told me later that Gerald had been in an impossible position for years, that Derek had, in a slow and careful way, made Gerald complicit, and then leveraged that complicity to ensure his silence. When the case broke open and Gerald understood that silence would mean the end of his career and possibly his freedom, he made the choice that self-preservation dictates and told the investigators everything. His cooperation reduced his exposure. He was disbarred regardless. He had earned that. Paul, Renata's husband, the quiet architect of the email campaign to shape the will, was a more complex casualty. He was named in the civil suit. His cooperation was slower in coming, and it came only after Renata, true to what she had said in the coffee shop, filed for divorce and retained her own attorney. Paul, faced with a divorce proceeding and a civil action simultaneously, chose to settle quickly and fully. Renata moved into a rental apartment in March. She called me twice that month, not to ask for anything, just to talk. The second call lasted 40 minutes and covered, in the fragmented and nonlinear way that real conversations between sisters sometimes go, 20 years of things neither of us had said. I didn't forgive her in that call. Forgiveness isn't a moment. But I left space for it. I left a door open that I had been holding shut for a very long time. Derek was charged with elder financial abuse, fraud, and forgery. His attorney negotiated aggressively. The process took the better part of a year. I will not walk through every hearing and filing. There were many, and they were exhausting in the way that legal processes are always exhausting, designed as they are to wear the human cost out of a situation until only the paperwork remains. What I will tell you is this. The restitution order required him to repay every dollar taken with interest. The Colorado property was liquidated. He served 8 months of a 14-month sentence, a number that will either feel too small or too large to you depending on where you stand, and I have made my peace with the fact that there was no number that would feel exactly right. I did not attend the sentencing. I had said what I needed to say in a written impact statement that Eleanor submitted to the court. I had written it 3 times before I found the version that was true without being either too hard or too soft. The version that reflected my mother's instruction about power and truth and the difference between the two. The house in Maine was everything the photographs had promised. I drove there in late April, 6 months after the will reading, on a morning when the sky over the coast was the particular transparent blue of early spring. I had the keys from Eleanor, an ordinary key ring, 2 keys completely unremarkable. I sat in the driveway for a moment before going in. The house smelled like sea air and old wood, and the specific, unnamed smell of a space that has been waiting patiently for someone to arrive. The garden was indeed overgrown. The rose bushes had gone rogue in a way that was more beautiful than tidy, sprawling toward the fence in great undisciplined arcs. I stood on the porch and looked at Penobscot Bay. The water was the color of hammered pewter in the early light, and it moved in the way that large bodies of water move. Not restlessly, but with a deep, unhurried authority, the movement of something that has always been here and will continue long after everything else has changed. I thought about my mother. I thought about all the Tuesday mornings in the car, the two of us moving through the particular quiet of early appointments, the way she would sometimes reach over and put her hand on my arm at a red light without saying anything, and I had always taken it as a small, habitual gesture. I understood now that it was not habitual. It was deliberate. She was touching me the way you touch something you're trying to memorize. She had been memorizing me. She had been watching me, all those years, with the same full attention she'd given me in the backyard over the caterpillar. She had seen everything. The driving, the research, the nights, the port dressing, the Agatha Christie novels, the way I stayed when everyone else found reasons to leave. She had seen it, and she had built me something in the silence of it. A house at the edge of the ocean, a trust, a documented truth, and a letter that said, "I saw you. I always saw you." The financial settlement from the civil suit eventually restored the estate to what it should have been, minus legal fees, minus the complexity and duration of the process, minus the emotional cost that no court can quantify. Renata received a reduced share, reflecting her partial complicity, determined by mediation rather than litigation. I received what was mine, the trust, the house, a full third of what my mother had actually intended, but it was the house that mattered. Not because of its value, because of what it meant that my mother had been buying it quietly for 18 years. She had started the mortgage when I was 23. She had been building this for me for 18 years. Through every family dinner where I sat in the invisible middle. Through every holiday where Derek dominated and Renata performed. Through every moment when I had believed, in the deep private way that middle children believe things, that I was simply less loved. She had been building me a house at the ocean. I found in the second bedroom, a small box that my mother had clearly left there on one of her visits. Eleanor told me she had been to the property twice in the last 2 years of her life, once with a friend and once alone, under the guise of a wellness retreat. In the box were a few things: a jar of the Earl Grey tea she knew I preferred, still sealed; a new Agatha Christie novel, one I hadn't read; a note card in her handwriting that said simply, "I thought you could start here." I sat on the floor of the second bedroom of a house I had owned for 4 years without knowing it, and I read the beginning of the Agatha Christie novel, and I drank the Earl Grey tea, and I did not try to stop crying. Later that evening, I sat on the porch as the light went out of the sky in long horizontal bands. Amber, then rose, then the particular deep blue that precedes dark. The bay moved. A lobster boat crossed toward the harbor. Somewhere down the shore, someone had lit a fire, and the smell of it drifted up on the wind. I thought about what my mother had asked me to do. Fight. And I had. Not perfectly. There is no perfect in a story like this, no clean resolution that leaves nothing complicated behind. Derek was somewhere I didn't think about. Renata was beginning the long, difficult work of becoming honest with herself. Gerald was gone. Paul was gone. What remained was this: the water, the house, the tea, and the certain, grounded knowledge that I had been loved by someone who did not always know how to say it plainly, but had spent 18 years saying it in the only language she could manage when plain language failed her. She had said it in wax and paperwork, and a trust document, and a house overlooking Penobscot Bay. She had said, "You were never invisible." She had said, "You were always the one I was building something for." And I had heard her. I sat on the porch until the stars came out, and they came out fully here, away from the city, the way they used to when I was small, and the world had not yet taught me to keep my expectations small alongside it. I looked at them for a long time. Then I went inside, made another cup of tea, and began to plan what I would plant in the garden come summer. The roses, I decided, could stay exactly as they were. Wild. Undisciplined. Sprawling toward everything. They had been waiting long enough to go wherever they wanted.